Jamie Iceman Stevenson, the drug kingpin, has been jailed for 20 years over a global plot to flood Scotland with £100 million worth of cocaine.
We know that he operates at the top table of organised criminality.
It's all about ego, it's all about power, it's all about violence and threats.
He is perhaps the most prolific drug dealer in Scotland in recent years.
Jamie, the Iceman Stevenson, the drug kingpin, has pleaded guilty on the fourth day of this trial to planning to flood Scotland with deadly drugs.
Not just a dealer in the sense of distribution within Scotland, but his criminal enterprise is truly international and it spans countries, continents and decades. He has been responsible for bringing in untold quantities of drugs, which in turn have killed record numbers of people in our country.
It's all about ego, it's all about power, it's all about violence and threats.
We know that he operates at the top table of organised criminality, but what I think this investigation demonstrated was just the extent of those international contacts and networks that he was operating with.
Jamie Stevenson grew up in North Glasgow and developed a reputation as a swaggering teenage street thug. He grew up in the Red Road flats in Barmulloch at a time when there was a heroin epidemic looming on the horizon of Scotland. So by the time the early 1980s arrived, Stevenson's reputation was becoming known throughout the underworld in the north of Glasgow. And there was one incident in particular where he attacked a man in a brutal knife assault in a petrol station, which drew the attention of big players in the underworld, and among those were the McGovern clan, and they were headed up by two notorious brothers known as Tommy and Tony. Stevenson formed a very close bond with Tony as the years progressed, and he became almost like a brother to Tony. The brotherly connection between Tony and Stevenson endured for many years, and Stevenson was sent on drug runs down to Liverpool. That became one of his routines as part of being in the gang. And during the course of that, it was mutually beneficial, because not only did they have a trustworthy lieutenant doing that particular job, but Stevenson was able to develop his own connections in Liverpool and the wider UK underworld, which would serve him well in the years to come. Like many productive relationships in the criminal underworld, it couldn't last forever, and there was an explosive fallout between Tony and Stevenson that would shape their futures in very dramatically and brutally different ways.
Glasgow in the 1980s was scarred by poverty, gangs, unemployment, crime and drugs. On these mean streets, one man reigned supreme, Arthur Thompson, dubbed the Godfather. Thompson had contacts the length and breadth of the UK, including the notorious Cray twins, and his fearsome reputation had been forged back in the 1950s. He enjoyed a dubious celebrity status in Scotland and wasn't shy in showing off the spoils from his decades in organised crime. The heir apparent to Glasgow's underworld was Paul Ferris, one of Thompson's enforcers. Ferris also enjoyed the limelight, his life story played out in the hit movie The Wee Man, but lengthy trials, blood rivalries, hitman allegations and years behind bars put paid to any kingpin ambitions. After Thompson's death in 1993, Tam the licensee McGraw emerged as the most obvious top player, though his reputation as a police informant meant he never earned the respect of a godfather figure. Instead, lesser known but ruthlessly ambitious crime mobs were operating away from the glare of the media as they vied for control of Glasgow's lucrative drugs and protection rackets. The Daniel and Lyons crews, headed by Jamie Daniel and Eddie Lyons, were building their own mini empires in the north of the city, while engaged in tit-for-tat street shootings and stabbings. Jamie Iceman Stevenson cut his teeth in Scotland's underworld as an enforcer for the notorious McGovern clan. He rose through the ranks as the mob grew in power in the 1990s to become one of Glasgow's most feared drug-dealing operations. His status seemed set in stone after he was best man at the wedding of kingpin pal Tony McGovern in July 1992. McGovern then returned the favour in 1998 when Stevenson married Caroline Adam, the mother of long-term sidekick Jerry Carbon. But Stevenson became a marked man after a fallout, and the McGoverns enlisted Robert Birdman O'Hara to have him rubbed out, but that plan backfired when the two joined forces. Then Tony McGovern was shot by a gunman on September the 16th, 2000. He was wearing a bulletproof vest when he was shot dead in his car outside this pub. No one has ever been found for the murder. One former journalist wrote a book about Jamie Stevenson called The Rise and Fall of a Crime Lord. Russell Findlay is now leader of the Scottish Conservative Party.
So as a journalist in the late 1990s, we were reporting extensively on major organised crime groups in Scotland who up until then had not received any form of attention. This included a family gang called the McGoverns, who were based in North Glasgow and Springburn, and Stevenson was connected to them very closely. He had a spectacular fallout with his friends in the McGovern family, the brothers, and that resulted in a series of tit-for-tat violence between them, resulting in a failed attempt to shoot Jamie Stevenson. And then not long thereafter, Tony McGovern, his former best friend, was shot dead in the street. Stevenson was very much the prime and indeed the only real suspect in that murder.
Yeah, the Tony McGovern shooting outside the Morven pub.
Remember it well.
Obviously, Jamie Stevenson, there was a lack of evidence to prosecute him. Do you believe that he was involved in that?
Well, there's no doubt that there were witnesses around the area who were terrified, and they declined to offer evidence in the normal way. Certainly the gossip around the area indicated that Stevenson was the main suspect and was a likely perpetrator of that murder, but there was an insufficient amount of evidence to take it to the court.
Russell wrote a book about Jamie Stevenson called The Rise and Fall of a Crime Lord, and recalls Iceman being sent down for money laundering in 2007, but questions why he was let off with drugs charges.
This book charts his beginnings involved in organised crime and rising up the kind of ladder, if you like, to creating what was an international drug smuggling network, which through the fantastic work of Scottish and police officers in Scotland and their counterparts across the UK, they brought that down, they smashed that network. Jamie Stevenson was imprisoned. He pled guilty at the High Court in Glasgow in 2007 to money laundering charges. This was part of a plea deal whereby the drug dealing charges were dropped. I found that questionable at the time. Nonetheless, he did get a significant prison sentence, which reflected the seriousness and scale of his operation. But as you say, the book was called The Rise and indeed The Fall. And I suppose what's happened since he's risen, quite spectacularly, and fallen again.
Following his release, it didn't take long for Stevenson to return to his old ways, and this time his trajectory to the top of Scotland's underworld was meteoric. An alliance with fellow Glasgow kingpin brothers James and Barry Gillespie was crucial in helping him develop a drug smuggling operation linking Scotland to South America. Underworld sources revealed to the Scottish Sun the crime lords developed a 50-50 power share deal as they masterminded a global drugs plot as long-standing allies. They worked side by side until 2019, when the Gillespies vanished, feared dead in Brazil, before James the Don White elevated himself to the top of their operation. But their lucrative smuggling streams would not last forever, and both White and Stevenson would soon see their globe-trotting criminal lifestyles crumble. An Underworld source gave an insight into the Gillespie-Stevenson nexus that supercharged their empires. The words are voiced by an actor to help protect their identity.
James Gillespie and Jamie Stevenson are the two equal bosses within the organisation. James White was moved to Brazil to be their representative. James and Barry Gillespie knew they were being hunted in connection with directing multiple murders, plus importing narcotics, weapons, explosives and money laundering. The brothers had no option than to disappear off the radar. The only connection White will have had with Stevenson is through James Gillespie, and you can be certain Stevenson will only have dealt with the Gillespie brothers and their close family members directly. When Stevenson stayed in Burnside, James Gillespie lived close by. They had equal partnership in every shipment arriving in the UK on the group's behalf. Stevenson has his own distribution networks. The wholesale has portion of the shipment, and the Gillespie brothers have theirs. When Stevenson was locked up, the brothers serviced his wholesale distribution network, and when the Gillespies became fugitives in 2019, Stevenson serviced their network.
By now, Stevenson's reputation and infamy in Scotland's underworld was such that he was even compared to Tony Soprano, the famous mafia boss from the hit TV show The Sopranos. Some say the media is often guilty of glamorising gangsters and their lavish lifestyles, which have been depicted in hit Hollywood films like Goodfellas and The Godfather.
As a journalist, I was very conscious of the fact it was a double-edged sword. The purpose of what we were doing was exposing these people, their activities, trying to disrupt them, trying to shine a light on this murky, dangerous, disgusting world. But some of these people, of course, inevitably quite liked that attention. And we were very careful, I was very careful about always wanting to ensure that we were not in any way contributing to glamorising criminals. I think taking The Sopranos as an example, if you look at that in the whole, most of them end up in a pretty sorry place. You know, that perhaps the message there is crime doesn't pay, but in the real world, all too often, crime does pay. Now, yes, Stevenson's going to jail for a very long time, hopefully. That said, his frontmen, his enablers, his white-collar supporters in the legal and accounting professions, you know, there's so much more that could be done, and I think that the authorities quite rightly should take great credit for bringing Jamie Stevenson to justice for a second time. But there should be so much more to be done in respect of the vast, dirty fortunes swirling about Scottish mainstream society.
A lot of people look at the sheer size of this operation, you know, cocaine coming from Ecuador, supposedly coming to a fruit market in Glasgow. A lot of people look at it and go, what's going on here? It's like, you know, it's like a TV episode of Sopranos.
Yes, well, he was described as Sopranos in previous occasion, and it certainly reflects the size of the industry that was created by this organised crime group. What strikes me today is that in the coming week, people are going to die in Scotland because of the abuse of drugs, and it's organisations such as the one led by Jamie Stevenson that brought the product into Scotland, which brought about decades of deaths and misery for many families in Scotland.
Stevenson was released in 2013 at the start of a decade of international drugs importation. Its scale emerged when he and 5 others were nicked in June 2020 over a £14 million Street Valium factory in Rochester in Kent. Astonishingly, he was bailed again and again fled to Spain. Most people wouldn't have got bail for that kind of offence.
Well, it's a big question that needs to be asked, and we need to get a clear response about how that was achieved. This is an organised crime figure who has just completed a significant sentence and is in the middle of what was a huge pill factory. Why it was decided that he was fit and proper for bail is a mystery, and of course immediately he got on his toes to Europe and disappeared.
For a guy that's operating at the pinnacle of organised crime, with the vast wealth at his disposal, and with the contacts that he has in different European countries, including the Netherlands and Spain, I found it to be incredible, high risk. Thankfully, you know, he was tracked down in Amsterdam by the police while he was out running. But this is a guy who, you know, if you give him an inch, he will take a mile.
Coming up in part 2, we reveal how Scotland's biggest drug dealer was snared by French and Dutch authorities who hacked the EncroChat mobile phone network.
If you were a police officer, you'd see this stuff and say it was absolute gold dust.
And we reveal more details of the sheer size and scale of Jamie Stevenson's cocaine operation.
It's a ton of cocaine. It's hard just for ordinary people to even think what that would involve.
And we delve into the powerful South America connection that links Scotland's leading mobsters to the biggest and most feared cartels on the planet.
They even used underwater divers to hide cocaine going to Scotland.